I'm Tom Hall. Welcome to Midday. You are a thorough government man. Benjamin Franklin wrote that in a letter to his son in 1774, a year before the War of Independence. I do not wonder at it, nor do I aim at converting you, he continued. Big Ben may not have wondered at it, but the rest of us sure have. How could it be that the son of one of the best-known and widely loved founding fathers remained fiercely loyal to the British crown, even after the war had separated America from England? Daniel Mark Epstein has written an intriguing new book about the complex relationship between the famous father and son. Plus, J. Wynn Russick reviews Finding Neverland at the Hippodrome Theater. Midday starts right after the news. Welcome to Midday, everybody. I'm Tom Hall. Very glad you're with us. By the way, later in the program today, theater critic J. Wynn Russick is going to review Finding Neverland. That's at the Hippodrome Theater here in Baltimore. But first, Daniel Mark Epstein joins me here in Studio A. Epstein is a prize-winning poet, playwright, and biographer whose writing career spans nearly 50 years. In addition to his 9 books of poetry, he's written several plays, plus many acclaimed biographies of an eclectic group of historic figures that includes Aimee Semple McPherson, Nat King Cole, Bob Dylan, and even Abraham Lincoln. So today he joins me to talk about his latest book, The Loyal Son, The War in Ben Franklin's House. It examines the relationship between Ben Franklin and his only son, William. So if you happen to come from a family where some people voted for Clinton and others voted for Trump, think about this. Benjamin Franklin, one of the most revered founding fathers of the country who helped draft the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, Ben Franklin, of all people, had a son who remained loyal to the British crown throughout and after the Revolutionary War. Daniel Mark Epstein's book is a fascinating read about a house divided and the turmoil within one prominent family during the struggle for American independence. It makes use of previously unknown source material, and it places this saga of loves won and lost, illegitimate children, and family intrigue in the context of our country's formative first years. Dan, it's good to see you.
Oh, always a pleasure, Tom.
If you'd like to join our conversation to talk about the Franklins, father and son, Ben and William, 410-662-8780. That's our number here on Midday. Our email, midday@wipr.org. And if you want to drop us a tweet, you can find us at Midday Tom Hall. So this subject has been covered before, but never with the sort of spotlight that you've put on it here in this really intriguing book. And you write in the acknowledgments that you actually pitched a different subject to your publisher, to your agent, I guess, and they convinced you that this was the one you should take up. So even you were, it sounds like, a little reluctant to embark on this. And any time you embark on a book, you research it so thoroughly. It's a commitment. So this is, 5 or 6 years in the making, this book. How'd you end up doing the Franklins?
Well, it was the most dramatic story that I could think of to tell at the time. And I actually had written, you may know this, Tom, because you've followed my career. This subject actually began as a poem. I published a poem about 17 years ago called The Lightning in the Key. I was intrigued by that image, the woodcut that all of us see of Benjamin Franklin and his son flying the kite in the thunderstorm.
Right.
And I was interested in what would it be like to have a father like Benjamin Franklin? I mean, such a remarkable man. And then I found out that the son was illegitimate, and then all these other details about his son being the most influential loyalist in America. And I thought, wow, that's a great story. But I did have a number of other ideas, and in certain ways the subject was daunting because the Franklin family, as you find out from reading the book, was pretty dysfunctional.
Yeah, boy, they do put the fun in dysfunctional. Yeah, I mean, there's illegitimate children and these liaisons and stuff. I mean, there's at one point you tell a great story about the great painter, is it Charles Wilson Peale?
Yes.
Sort of barged in on Ben Franklin having a little amorous liaison with a serving girl in the house, and he made a painting out of it.
Right.
And it's actually hanging somewhere.
It's hanging in the American Philosophical Society today, if you want to go look at it. Anyway, so I had a number of ideas. I was thinking about writing a book about Poe, and I had some other ideas, but my agent and my editor convinced me that this was a great subject, and that it had been neglected, in this. All the fascinating books have been written about Benjamin Franklin. This part remain sort of neglected.
It was kind of fun. I mean, I think I read Walter Isaacson's biography of Franklin, which is was a pretty popular one, and that was maybe 15 years ago or so, whenever that came out. But thinking about Benjamin Franklin through the prism of the conflict that he has had as a father, where his own kid is on the opposite side politically, it was fascinating. But how common was it within families and within communities to have, next door neighbors or fathers and sons or aunts and uncles be on opposite side of to revolt or not revolt?
It was very common, probably more common than it was during the Civil War, because the Civil War was more of a geographic, can be described more geographically. The Revolution really was colony by colony, a war and a conflict of families and communities. So it was fairly common. And, of course, this is one of the more dramatic instances, and because these were such high-profile people. And in the case of William Franklin, the son, being the governor of New Jersey, he got himself into terrible trouble by holding on to his chair as governor when all of the other colonial governors stepped aside, went along with the program.
He ended up in jail. Ended up in some pretty rough jails for a while. I mean, he was convicted of treason. I mean, the whole 9 yards with this guy.
Yeah, and he ended up in one of the most notoriously low prisons in America, the Litchfield Jail in Connecticut. And the conventional wisdom is that Benjamin never lifted a finger. I keep hearing that phrase over it. Never lifted a finger to get his son out of prison. When Benjamin Franklin was a very powerful man, he was the minister plenipotentiary to France and involved with prisoner exchange. Supposedly, he never did anything to get his son out of jail, and that's part of what I wanted to explore, because I wasn't convinced that was really going to be the case.
Yeah, and you make a pretty strong case that that in fact wasn't the case. I mean, he had guys like George Washington on his side. I mean, William Franklin. Washington was reluctant to keep him in prison and was looking for ways of springing him.
That's right. And one of my relatives who was very interested in the story said, look for hidden communication between William Franklin and Benjamin Franklin. There must have been some way that the two of them managed to communicate during this time when it was hazardous for both of them. And if you can find that link, you might find out that Benjamin Franklin, in fact, even though he was 3,000 miles away in France, may have pulled a string or two to get William released.
You did find a whole bunch of stuff that other folks have not found. That in itself is pretty amazing, to think that a person like Benjamin Franklin, I mean, the other great American figure, one of the many other great American figures you've written about is Abraham Lincoln, who is, I think, the single most written about historic figure in the world. And you've written, two or three books about Lincoln. But how is it possible that in the 2012, 13, 14, whenever you were working on this book, there's still correspondence and documents pertaining to Benjamin Franklin that somebody hasn't dug up yet? That's amazing.
Well, partly it's a matter of looking closely at documents that scholars might have glanced at but didn't look closely enough at. For instance, the very well-edited letters of George Washington. There were a number of letters back and forth from William Franklin to George Washington that they were there, but nobody paid any attention to them. And then, of course, there was probably the most notable thing is that the editors of the magisterial papers of Benjamin Franklin that are at Yale University, they actually did discover a document called the Abstract of Vouchers, which William Franklin presented when he was in exile in the 1780s that includes excerpts of letters to and from his father that no one had ever seen. So I was just fortunate in being in touch with the curators there, and they showed me that. But a lot of it was a lot of the correspondence of Benjamin Franklin and William Franklin has not been published. And we have access now with the digitalization of documents. Historians have enormous advantages now in terms of accessing things. I didn't have to travel 10 times.
Right,
10 times to, 7 different libraries in order to find my material. I was able to do a lot of it from, the comfort of my study at home.
Yeah, you and Uncle Google. Right. 410-662-8780. That's the number to get in touch with Dan Epstein about his new book, The Loyal Son. Our email, midday@wypr.org, and our Twitter handle @middaytomhall. These letters, which really form the sort of the armament of your argument here, are really incredible. There's one from William Franklin to his contemporary George Washington. They were virtually the same age, and obviously growing up in the same spotlight of the public eye. You call it a superb work where Franklin is asking Washington for mercy. He wants to get out of prison to be allowed to visit his wife. And she was sick, and it turns out he was not granted that permission, and she died. But it's very sad. But the prose of these letters, as a writer, as a wonderful writer, you have an appreciation for the power, the poignancy, the beauty, the arc of the prose of the way Benjamin wrote, William wrote, Washington wrote, and a whole cast of other characters. It's really quite extraordinary.
Yeah, these people were remarkably articulate, and one of the pleasures of writing this book was reading all of that great prose, some of it really poetic. As I mentioned in the book, William Franklin had a touch of the poet in him. His father was much more practical, pragmatic, but William wrote beautifully, and the letter that you were mentioning is one of the great letters. Part of my challenge as a biographer was to come up with a narrative voice that would somehow match the prose style of the 18th century. Because otherwise it would be very jarring, be going along
to go from one to the other.
Modern American prose. So I had to search to find that. That was one of the big challenges of writing this particular book, was to find that narrative voice.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, because you are, as a poet, you are very sensitive to the power of the music of the sentence and not just the meaning of the sentence. Yeah, that's interesting.
Right. And so the voice that you're going to encounter in this book is it's different from the voice that I used to write the books about Lincoln or Amy Semple McPherson.
Yeah, or Bob Dylan. Yeah.
Or Bob Dylan.
Yeah. And 15,000 of these letters you report were actually were almost lost.
Right.
His Benjamin Franklin's grandson Temple, who was, I guess, the son of William, right?
Right.
Another
illegitimate
one. So one illegitimate son begets another. It needed it to use as collateral for a loan, and it ended up in some warehouse somewhere.
Yeah, and some barrels up above a stable somewhere in the suburbs of Philadelphia. Temple was something of a ne'er-do-well, and his grandfather doted upon him. Benjamin loved his grandson Temple and left him all of his papers. And Temple just didn't know how to manage them. He badly edited them and nearly lost, as you said, barrels of them just by leaving them in the suburb of Philadelphia as collateral for a loan. And some of them were used as party favors.
Yeah, I've left a couple of T-shirts, in the suburbs of Philadelphia, but never anything like 15,000 letters from my grandfather, Benjamin Franklin. All right, when we come back, we'll talk more. I want to talk about this very interesting information that you've unearthed about something called the Asgill affair, which is another point of reference here that a lot of folks have not delved into before. Daniel Mark Epstein is here. The book is called The Loyal Son, The War in Ben Franklin's House. When we come back, more on Mr. Franklin and his son. 410-662-8780. Our email, midday@wypr.org. Drop us a tweet as well, @midday.tomhall.
This is WYPR.
Welcome back. It's midday. I'm Tom Hall. By the way, coming up tomorrow on the program, it's the Midday News Wrap. AP White House correspondent Julie Bykowitz and historian, author, and Emory University professor Dr. Carol Anderson will join me as we try to make sense of the week's news. We're also going to hear from a wonderful a cappella group from Zimbabwe called Inzingizi. They'll sing for us live here in Studio A. That's coming up tomorrow on Midday. If you're just joining us today, my guest is the acclaimed poet, playwright, and biographer Daniel Mark Epstein. We're talking about his latest book, The Loyal Son, The War in Ben Franklin's House. He'll be talking about the book tonight at the Ivy Bookshop in North Baltimore up on Falls Road. You are welcome to join our conversation, 410-662-8780. Our email, midday@wypr.org, and to join us on Twitter @midday Tom Hall. Dan, let's take a phone call. Karen in Baltimore, welcome to Midday with Dan Epstein.
Yes, thank you. I'm looking forward to reading this book. I actually have a little bit of a crush on Ben Franklin. He's probably my favorite of all the founding fathers, and like to read everything about him I can find. And I have a question. I've noticed that often in history, great men and women don't produce such great kids. I'm thinking of FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt. Their 5 or 6 kids didn't turn out too well, as I remember. And Winston Churchill also, I don't think his kids turned out so great. So I was wondering, as a historian, if you have any theories about that.
That's an interesting thought. Thanks for the call, Karen.
Well, yeah, that is an interesting thought. Just to talk about Benjamin Franklin and his children, he had a son and a daughter, and they were both extraordinary. William Franklin was talented and charming and had a great career. He just happened to be on the wrong side of the revolution, in his father's opinion. He also had a daughter named Sarah, who was 10 years younger than William, and she was extraordinary, intelligent and beautiful, and had a wonderful family and marriage. And really was the heart of the Franklin family, really kept everybody together in that generation. As for your more general question, I think that sometimes these great figures cast a deep shadow. I mean, it's very hard to live in the shadow of a great personage. The figure that's often used is the smaller trees don't get enough sunlight, in the shade of the great trees. I think that's probably as good an explanation as I can think of. Of course, there are exceptions. You think of the family like the Morgan family, where there were generation after generation of extraordinary men and women who existed in that family.
You write in the very introduction to this book, when we talk about the extraordinary nature of this man, Benjamin Franklin, and his son, who, as you say, was quite accomplished. But Benjamin Franklin, you write, he had mysterious talents, an ability to see things, events, objects before they appeared to his senses, plus his potent influence upon people of all ages. He couldn't account for it. And he was incredibly influential, but when you look at the scope of his career, the scientific discoveries he made, the diplomatic work that he did, being one of the founding fathers and leading the revolution, creating publishing as we know it, essentially, or creating, I suppose that's too broad, but making publishing. I mean, he was very rich. I mean, he got rich as a publisher. He just did. He had this voracious sexual appetite. I mean, he was all over the place with women and stuff. He came from a broken family himself. I mean, he ran away from home as a little kid. It's extraordinary the extent of his gifts.
Yeah, he really was. In American history, this is the closest thing we have to a Renaissance man. A kind of Odysseus or Ulysses. He could do anything, and was, as our caller mentioned, I mean, he was charismatic. He was one of the most charming men who ever lived. He was irresistible to men and women. I don't know how you account for this. I think if you'd asked Benjamin Franklin at age 20 or 30 or 40, to what do you attribute your success, he would not know how to answer either. I think he would probably say, "Oh well, I got a robust physique and enormous curiosity about the world, endless curiosity." He mostly was self-taught. And I think that's probably all he could say.
Let's talk about this thing known as the Asgill affair. And it's one of the scenes in the book. It's one of the scenarios that you describe in great detail. There's a young man who was 19 years old who was being held by George Washington and sentenced to death for treason and stuff. And this was retribution, I guess, for the killing of some American soldiers by the British. Give us the sort of thumbnail sketch of this story and why the Asgill affair is important and illuminating in our study of Franklin, and also the fact that people have not been interpreting it the way you have and your sources have led you to interpret it.
Well, it was one of the discoveries that I was very proud of. The Asgill affair happened very late in the war, actually after the surrender of Cornwallis, when the war should have been over. There was still a civil war going on in New Jersey and in South Carolina between the Loyalists and the Patriots. It shouldn't have been happening, but it was, and this sometimes happens. In our American Civil War, there was something similar. In any case, William Franklin, after he got out of prison, probably should have gone back to England, but he didn't. He became
and he got out
a guerrilla.
in 1778 or something like that. Or?
Yeah, 1788.
Or 80,
and then he went
sorry.
to and then he went to live in live in New York. In any case, he became a guerrilla, an anti, a counter-revolutionary, and some of the men that he was in charge of hung a patriot, and this became very public, and they admitted that it was an act of retribution for all of the loyalists who had been killed after the surrender of Cornwallis. And George Washington, the pressure was put on George Washington by his own generals, as well as the people of New Jersey, to hang a British soldier in retaliation. And he didn't want to do it. And he delayed. George Washington found all sorts of ways of not hanging this boy in retribution, which he thought was madness and savagery. And when it became known on the other side of the water, in France and in England, that this young man, who happened to be the son of the mayor of London, was going to be hanged, people didn't know they didn't know how to handle it. The French minister wanted to intervene and decided to write a letter to George Washington asking him to reprieve this boy. But in fact, what I discovered through textual analysis is that it was probably not the French minister, Vergennes, who wrote this now very famous letter pleading for the life of this British soldier, but Benjamin Franklin.
So this is a letter that people thought someone else had written.
Yeah.
But you make the case that Franklin himself wrote it.
Yeah, and it worked. At the 11th hour, this letter came. I mean, imagine, it took 6 weeks for Benjamin Franklin to learn about this, and the people in Europe to learn about this, and another 2 months for the letter to get back. Meanwhile, Washington stalled, and just as they were about to hang the boy, this letter came to Washington. He gave it to the Continental Congress, and they couldn't. They thought it was a miracle. They thought it was a miracle. Of course, they didn't know Benjamin Franklin. Nobody knew until I did this analysis. And that virtually saved the boy's life. And what is fascinating in the context of this book is that Benjamin Franklin knew that his son William was implicated in this whole thing.
Yeah.
So he didn't want this boy, this innocent person, to die because of his son William's stubbornness and foolishness.
410-662-8780 is the number to call to be in touch with Daniel Mark Epstein about his new book, The Loyal Son. Our email, midday@wypr.org. You can also drop us a tweet at @middaytomhall. Let's go to the phones. Mark in Catonsville, welcome to Midday. Thanks for your call.
Hi there. You caught me at a good time. I'm actually in the middle of another biography of Franklin. And it brought home to me that he was not a normal person. I mean, he really was extraordinary in all kinds of ways. And one of them was that he was very public-minded. I mean, he founded the first public library. He founded the first fire department, all kinds of things, post office. His whole life was that way. But I think as a father, as a family man, I think he did sacrifice that part of his life. And I think if William had been his friend and not his son, he would have forgiven him. But I think he just couldn't go that far. And I kind of fault him a little bit for that myself.
You make a really good point. And, sometimes the most bitter passions that we feel are for the people that we're closest to. So you make a very good point.
Yeah, good point, Mark. And Dan, that brings up an interesting thing. Let me ask you to read just a paragraph from the new book talking about the conflict that Benjamin Franklin, the father, had with Benjamin Franklin, the public figure.
All right. It is difficult to fathom the anguish Benjamin Franklin felt at this time. Impossible not to grieve with a father over the conduct and fate of his only son. One day he would confess that nothing had ever hurt him so much. From the time he returned from England, he had done everything to persuade William to change his course, or at least trim his sails, until he could withdraw gracefully. And now, for the rest of his life, Dr. Franklin would have to suffer the judgment of men like Ambrose Searle, Lord Howe's secretary, who called William a steady, honest man whose father is and has been every way his misfortune. These would always believe that Dr. Franklin had forsaken the sacred duties of parenthood regarding William and, quote, thrown off all natural affection for him. Even Strahan, his best friend, would call him to account.
Yeah, the misfortune of having Benjamin Franklin as your father. That's really quite extraordinary. When did they become estranged? Did they ever make up? And when each of them died, where did the relationship stand?
Well, they became estranged as soon as the revolution, 1776. Benjamin Franklin, because of the sensitivity of his position, I mean, he was on the Committee of Correspondence, and and then was sent to France as the minister there to try to create an alliance. He could not be viewed by anyone as in sympathy with his son, the Tory. He just
who was
couldn't
the royally appointed governor of New Jersey.
Governor of New Jersey. He could not have any communication whatever with his son, lest people accuse them of collusion. So that's when they became estranged. And although there's a lot of indication that there was communication, secret communication between the two of them, until William was released from prison and started this counter-revolutionary activity, this really violent activity, which is fascinating to read about. That was the point where I think Benjamin said, I don't think I can ever really reconcile with my son. I don't think it's going to happen. Now, on William's side, he continued to hold out hope until his father went back to Philadelphia from France in the 1780s. After the war was over, he continued to hold out hope that there would be reconciliation, but it never really happened.
Can you speculate as to why it is that William held to his beliefs in this matter? Why he was never persuaded by his father and all of his father's friends and the general, zeitgeist of the revolutionary spirit coursing through the colonies? Why he remained so tenaciously loyal? Because, as you say, not only did he stay loyal until the war started, but then he was in prison, and after the war, he kept trying to undermine the newly formed country. I mean, he never gave up on this.
Well, he was stubborn.
Clearly.
He was stubborn. He was a man of principle. And remember that he had been formed. He had been formed in his 20s and early 30s by the monarchy. He was in England at a time. He was there for the coronation of George III. He actually marched in the ceremony of that coronation. He felt very, very strongly, as did Benjamin Franklin until 1775, that the empire was the best possible solution for the future of England and America. Continued to feel that way until the end, and he wasn't the only one. He wasn't the only one. But I think it's possible to read into this, and I do somewhat. I think there was a lot of father-son rivalry here, and they were both set in their ways, and neither was going to give in. And this is what makes it a fascinating microcosm of the war itself, the Revolutionary War itself. The war happened because people would not compromise. And William was uncompromising. Yeah. He was a man of principle. And when he went back to England, when he went back to England, he was a hero there. He lived out his life in retirement as an honored servant of the king.
410-662-8780. That's our number here on Midday with Daniel Mark Epstein about his new book, The Loyal Son. It's about the Franklins, Benjamin and William. Our email address, midday@wypr.org, and to drop us a tweet at Midday Tom Hall. One of the things that struck me is the many parallels we have in today's culture. And by today, I mean like today or yesterday, this week, and the notion of leaking. Because there's all sorts of letters that mysteriously show up in the public domain that were not intended to be in the public domain. You mentioned the Committee of Correspondence. That's the Continental Congress Secret Committee of Correspondence, which Ben Franklin headed, and you call it basically the precursor to the CIA. He was the first head of the CIA on top of everything else he did. And he for example, came into possession of some letters by the governor of Massachusetts at the time, a guy named Thomas Hutchinson, and Franklin made the decision to make sure that these got out and saw the light of day. I mean, he was doing all sorts of daring-do and behind-the-back stuff and espionage, essentially.
He leaked these letters. These were letters of the governor of Massachusetts to some people in Parliament, basically calling for an abridgment of civil liberties. And it's a kind of a complicated story, but Franklin at the time said the reason why he had exposed these letters, first of all, he had no business having, nobody knows how he got the letters. This is one of history's secrets. But anyway, he got the letters, decided to send them to the Assembly of Massachusetts, saying this would somewhat quell the revolutionary fervor there, because when he read these letters, he thought, well, the problem is in the English Parliament. It's that American governor over there who's causing all the trouble. But the whole thing backfired, and made everybody in Massachusetts even angrier than they were before at the governor and at the Parliament. They didn't separate the two things. So it's a kind of comedy of errors. And for years, people have believed that Benjamin Franklin's leaking of these letters was to quell the discord, but he must have known, in my opinion, that it would inflame things.
Right. This was going to set off more fireworks.
It was going to set off more fireworks.
Yeah. And of course, he went back and forth from being, he was a hero in England, he was a goat in England, he was a hero in America, he was a goat in America. I mean, the public perception of him was wildly erratic.
Yeah. And at the end of his life, actually, by the time the revolution started, he was persona non grata in England. If he'd gone to England, he would have been arrested for purloining these letters of Thomas Hutchinson. So he could never go back to England again after 1775.
For much of the book, up through the beginning of the Revolution, 1775, Benjamin and his son were quite affectionate and close. And there's all sorts of documentary evidence that you present here. There's letters that are very affectionate. One of the fun things about this relationship is that, like many sons, he was always borrowing money or asking for money from his father, and his father was doling it out. But in this case, the father kept very particular records of every dime. Of course, they didn't have dimes then, but every pound he gave to his son. And this whole thing about how you owe me money, and I lent you this money, and he kept these very accurate records of the accounts between the two of them, and that struck you, it seemed, as a buyer, a little strange, and it certainly struck me as a reader.
Yeah, I was horrified by that. It seemed to me, particularly since a lot of the money that Franklin had given his son was given to him when they were working together in England. He should have been paying for those expenses. He continued to keep strict accounting of that forever. And the thing to remember is Benjamin Franklin was rich. This man had enormous amounts of money, and his son wasn't a ne'er-do-well by any means. I mean, he intended to pay back the debts if he could, but I don't know. I can't imagine keeping accounts like that for my own kids, and I've got 4 of them.
Yeah, right. Let's see if we can sneak in one more call before we have to let you go. Aaron in Baltimore, welcome to Midday with Daniel Mark Epstein.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering, I remember reading, I don't know if it was in that book White Trash or somewhere, about Benjamin Franklin and his attitude. I can't remember. It was either toward the slaves or toward Indians, and it was really shocking, that he would have this attitude, because he's, one of our great heroes. Anyway, maybe...
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, Aaron. And Daniel, you do write about this.
Yeah. He was totally... He was a great defender of the Native Americans. Wrote famously about the certain specific massacres of Indians and how it was totally wrong. And was very involved in the Paxton affair when a scalp bounty was put on the Indians. So he really was very heroic in his defense of Native Americans, and then later in life. Was very interested in abolition. So
I mean, as a Quaker and stuff, certainly very, very much.
He was not. He was not a Quaker, but
but in that milieu in Pennsylvania and stuff. William, as you say, it was an accomplished guy. We just have a little bit of time left here. What's your ultimate assessment of him as? If you take as a given what he was trying to accomplish, you may not agree with what his aspiration was, but given that he was trying to continue to promote the interests of the royal crown in Britain even after the Revolutionary War, was he successful? Was he good at it?
He was the best at it. I would say he was the best colonial governor, the best politician in terms of avoiding violence in New Jersey. In terms of trying to effect compromise and a peace, and to keep New Jersey within the empire. He was excellent, a great politician.
Well, this is a terrific book, Dan. I really appreciate your coming by and talking about it.
Thank you. Coming from you, that's high praise.
Well, you're very sweet. Daniel Mark Epstein, his new book is called Loyal Son, The War in Ben Franklin's House. He'll be reading from his book tonight at the Ivy Bookshop in North Baltimore. That event starts at 7 o'clock, and we've got a link to more information at wypr.org/midday. Stay with us. Coming up, Midday theater critic J. Wynn Russick will fly in here with a review of Finding Neverland at the Hippodrome Theater here in Baltimore. You're listening to Midday. I'm Tom Hall. Stay with us. We're going to go out with some music from the time of Ben Franklin. This is by Willibald Gluck. It's called I've Lost My Eurydice.